England, summer of 1940. At the Royal Air Force Station in Hornchurch, Essex, a pair of matching Supermarine Spitfires rest on the tarmac. Each aircraft carries the same Merlin power plant, identical 8-gun configuration, and the same aviator secured in the cockpit ready for flight. Squadron leader Desmond Cook advances the throttle on aircraft number 1. Distance required for departure, 320 yards. Ascent time to reach 20,000 feet, 11 minutes and 8 seconds. Maximum operational altitude as oxygen thins and the power plant struggles for air, 32,000 feet. After 20 minutes pass, Cook settles into the cockpit of the second Spitfire. Matching fuselage, matching power plant, but a distinctly different propeller assembly. Launch distance, 225 yards. Time required to achieve 20,000 feet, 7 minutes and 42 seconds. Operational ceiling, 39,000 feet. Identical warplane, identical power plant, identical conflict, teetering on a knife's edge. The margin separating triumph from catastrophe in Britain's greatest aerial battle rested upon 3 rotating aluminum surfaces that aeronautical authorities throughout the United States had declared impossibly intricate. Frank Caldwell's revolutionary propeller concept, destined to accelerate American bombing aircraft by 100 miles per hour, had just demonstrated its worth above the British landscape. Yet, the chronicle of how a single determined engineer's calculations overcame an entire sector's preconceptions starts 8 years prior inside a manufacturing plant where unanimous opinion held his concept unworkable. Frank Walker Caldwell positioned himself within the lubrication testing chamber at Hamilton Standard Propeller Corporation, located in East Hartford, Connecticut, on a dreary February dawn in 1932. At 43 years of age, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology educated mechanical engineer possessed the systematic demeanor of someone who placed faith in calculations above conventional thinking. Wire-framed spectacles sat precisely upon his features, notepad constantly within reach of his work-hardened fingers. Mounted behind him on a testing apparatus that shuddered with mechanical intensity, a gleaming metallic propeller rotated unlike anything aviation had witnessed. 3 aluminum surfaces capable of altering their angular position while spinning at 2,400 rotations each minute. The telephone communication that would alter everything had arrived 3 days prior from Boeing's Seattle facility. Boeing's Model 247, the nation's groundbreaking commercial transport, remained grounded at Denver's municipal aerodrome like a champion racehorse crippled by injury. At an elevation of 5,280 feet, the twin power plant Marvel, designed to transport passengers transcontinentally in unprecedented time, failed to ascend beyond the Rocky Mountain range. 2. Timber propeller surfaces locked at a singular angular setting, optimized for just one operational state, rendered the machine practically worthless under different conditions. Pan American Airways President Juan Trippe had issued an ultimatum to Boeing that very morning: resolve this immediately or face cancellation in favor of Douglas. The consequences couldn't be more severe. United Airlines had placed orders for 25 Model 247 aircraft. TWA desired 30. However, none of these commitments mattered if America's most sophisticated airliner couldn't navigate a mountain range. Caldwell had encountered this resistance previously. Throughout the American aviation sector, accepted knowledge circulated like religious doctrine, from maintenance facilities to executive suites. Variable angle propellers represented a solution seeking a problem. Excessive weight relative to performance benefit, excessive complexity for dependable function, excessive precision manufactured components operating within harsh environments where lubricants solidified at elevation and mechanical vibration destroyed delicate machinery. The Army Air Corps Engineering Division had formally designated Caldwell's hydraulic concept as mechanically unsound. Even Charles Lindbergh, aviation's most renowned authority, had expressed reservations regarding the design during a confidential consultation at Wright Field the previous fall. However, Caldwell maintained the understated assurance of an engineer whose theories had been validated before, during his tenure as the government's principal propeller engineer from 1917 through 1928, he had observed aviation authorities oppose metallic propellers because timber was supposedly lighter, resist ground-adjustable designs, citing excessive complication. Each instance, his information had shattered their presumptions. Each instance, the sector had ultimately proceeded where his calculations directed. This occasion felt distinctly different. This occasion, professional futures and corporate survival hung in uncertainty. Hamilton Standard had committed everything to Caldwell's transformative concept: 800 employment positions in East Hartford, alongside manufacturing, agreements extending from Connecticut westward to California. The enterprise that had manufactured propellers for Lindbergh's Spirit of St. Louis faced potential collapse if Caldwell's computations proved inaccurate. His personal standing, constructed across 25 years developing propeller technology, depended upon 3 rotating surfaces and a hydraulic regulation mechanism that utilized power plant lubrication pressure to automatically modify surface angle based upon flight circumstances. The technical approach was elegant through its straightforwardness. Throughout departure and ascent, when maximum thrust was critical, the propeller automatically transitioned to shallow angle like an automobile's first gear, permitting the power plant to rotate faster and produce greater thrust. At operational elevation, the mechanism transitioned to steep angle for optimal velocity and fuel conservation. Should a power plant fail, the propeller could rotate its surfaces parallel to wind direction, removing resistance that would otherwise force the aircraft into a deadly rotation. The calculations communicated with mathematical precision. Caldwell's aerodynamic testing at MIT had demonstrated that constant rotation propellers could enhance ascent velocity by 40%, increase operational ceiling by 7,000 feet, and advance fuel conservation by 15% throughout all operational conditions. However, calculations held no value if the aviation sector refused acceptance. The pivotal moment arrived February 15, 1933, when United Airlines President Pat Patterson authorized Hamilton Standard one ultimate opportunity: a single evaluation flight with their unconventional propeller mounted on a Boeing 247. Evaluation aviator Eddie Allen, a former naval pilot with extraordinary composure, would subject Caldwell's hypothesis to the conclusive examination. Above the identical Rocky Mountain geography that had stranded the matching aircraft, 14 days earlier, Allen ascended steadily. Beyond 6,000 feet, the elevation that had defeated the fixed angle, 247, then 8,000, then 10,000 feet, traversing the Continental Divide as though it were merely an inconvenience on a rural route. The constant rotation propeller adjusted automatically to each elevation modification, sustaining optimal power plant RPM while maximizing thrust. Where the fixed-angle aircraft had struggled to achieve 6,000 feet above Denver, the modified 247 reached an operational ceiling of 20,700 feet. The cruising velocity enhancement was similarly remarkable. 15 miles per hour, faster across all elevations, with 12% superior fuel conservation at standard cruising thrust configurations. Patterson received the evaluation data by telegram that very evening. Constant rotation propeller surpasses all performance specifications. Recommend immediate implementation across entire United Fleet. Yet as purchase orders flooded into Hamilton Standard's East Hartford operation, a more ominous reality was materializing on the international stage. Within Germany, the National Socialist Party had claimed authority. Within Japan, military commanders discussed Pacific territorial expansion publicly. Conflict clouds gathered across Europe and Asia, and the propeller advancement, originally conceived for airline passenger convenience, was about to become America's concealed advantage. The telephone sounded in Caldwell's workspace on a humid May afternoon in 1933. The voice identified himself as Commander John Towers from the Naval Department's Bureau of Aeronautics. Their interest concerned fighters, rapid fighters capable of outclimbing and outpacing anything German or Japanese engineering was producing, and bombing aircraft capable of flying higher and faster than hostile interceptors could engage. The era of aerial combat was emerging, and Frank Caldwell possessed the innovation that would establish American aerial dominance. The telegram reached Hamilton Standard, November 13, 1933, carrying information that would confirm everything Frank Caldwell had struggled to demonstrate. The National Aeronautic Association declared that Hamilton Standard Propeller Corporation had received the Collier Trophy, aviation's supreme recognition, for advancement of a controllable angle propeller with specific acknowledgement to Frank W. Caldwell. President Franklin Roosevelt would personally commend him during a White House gathering in December. Yet even as photographers documented Caldwell exchanging handshakes with the president, the aviation establishment maintained stubborn doubt. At Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, Army evaluation pilots voiced bitter complaints regarding the additional complexity that constant rotation propellers introduced into combat aircraft. Major Benjamin Kelsey, director of the Army Air Corps Fighter Projects Office, articulated the apprehensions that resonated through military facilities nationwide. What occurs when that hydraulic mechanism fails above Germany? When lubrication pressure diminishes and the propeller locks, fixed-angle designs don't malfunction because there's nothing to malfunction. Caldwell's reply was characteristically systematic. If military aviators required proof of dependability under combat circumstances, he would provide information that eliminated all uncertainty. Operating 18-hour workdays in Hamilton Standard's enlarged testing operation, he developed what became designated the rotation test, mounting propellers on stationary platforms to measure thrust, endurance, velocity, and structural integrity. Under extreme circumstances that surpassed anything aircraft would experience in genuine combat, the technical advancement that enabled everything was elegant through its mechanical simplicity. Caldwell's hydromatic propeller utilized power plant lubrication pressure to operate a cylinder that modified surface angle through a mechanism of gearing and counterweights. A centrifugal regulator, no larger than a coffee, container sustained constant RPM regardless of flight. Circumstances by automatically adjusting surface angle when the aircraft ascended and atmospheric density diminished. The propeller automatically transitioned to shallow angle, aviation's equivalent of reduced gearing, to sustain power plant RPM and maximize thrust during cruising flight. The mechanism transitioned to steep angle for maximum velocity and fuel conservation. If power plant RPM increased excessively during a descent, the propeller automatically steepened angle to prevent overspeed destruction. Most transformative was the feathering function. Should a power plant fail entirely, lubrication pressure from the functioning power plants could rotate the inactive propeller's surfaces parallel to wind direction, removing the substantial resistance that would otherwise force a multi-power plant aircraft into an unmanageable rotation. For bombing crews operating deep within hostile territory, this singular feature could represent the distinction between returning home on functioning power plants or becoming another casualty. The performance enhancements were indisputable when converted into combat capability. A P-51 Mustang, equipped with Caldwell's constant rotation propeller versus the identical aircraft with fixed-angle surfaces, demonstrated dramatic distinctions throughout every operational condition. Departure distance reduced by 30%, permitting fighters to launch from abbreviated airfields nearer to frontline positions. Ascent velocity increased by 40%, eliminating precious minutes from the duration required to achieve intercept elevation. Operational ceiling expanded by 7,000 feet, granting American fighters elevation superiority above hostile aircraft. Combat operational distance extended by 200 miles as fuel conservation improved by 15% throughout all thrust configurations. However, figures on evaluation documentation meant nothing if the propellers malfunctioned when aviators required them critically. Caldwell's fixation with dependability compelled him to evaluate every element beyond its specifications. Propeller surfaces were subjected to forces 50% greater than maximum combat strain. Hydraulic regulators operated continuously for 500 hours at temperature extremes from 40 degrees below freezing to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Lubrication seals were evaluated with contaminants that replicated combat destruction and maintenance. Disregard. The opposition from established aviation manufacturers intensified as Hamilton Standard's contract ledgers filled with military commitments. Curtiss-Wright, manufacturer of fixed-angle propellers for most Army Air Corps fighters, initiated a lobbying effort arguing that constant rotation propellers were an unnecessary complication that would sacrifice American aviators' survival. Their principal engineer, Dr. George Meade, published technical documentation questioning whether hydraulic mechanisms could function dependably at combat elevations where temperatures descended to 60 degrees below freezing and lubrication. Viscosity increased dramatically. Caldwell responded with additional information. His cold environment evaluations at 35,000 feet demonstrated that the hydromatic mechanism actually performed superior at high elevation because thicker lubrication provided more positive pressure regulation, vibration. Evaluations demonstrated that constant rotation propellers experience fewer mechanical malfunctions than fixed-angle concepts because automatic angle adjustment eliminated the resonance wavelengths that fractured propeller hubs and loosened attachment hardware. The breakthrough instance occurred during a presentation at Selfridge Field in Michigan. March 21, 1934, two matching P-26 fighters departed simultaneously, one equipped with the standard fixed-angle propeller, the other with Caldwell's constant rotation mechanism. The performance distinction was so dramatic that observing aviators initially suspected the constant rotation aircraft carried a more powerful power plant. Ascent time to 10,000 feet, 8 minutes 30 seconds for the fixed-angle fighter, 5 minutes 40 seconds for the constant rotation version. Maximum velocity at 15,000 feet, 187 miles per hour versus 203 miles per hour. Operational ceiling, 28,000 feet versus 34,500 feet. Lieutenant Colonel Carl Spaatz, who would later direct all American strategic aerial forces in Europe, submitted a documentation that evening recommending immediate implementation of constant rotation propellers for all Army Air Corps fighters and bombing aircraft. The performance superiority, he documented, is so substantial that it represents a fundamental transformation in combat capability. Any aerial force equipped with constant rotation propellers will possess decisive superiority above adversaries utilizing fixed-angle mechanisms. As 1934 concluded, Hamilton Standard's manufacturing operations functioned continuously to fulfill orders from the Army, Navy, and civilian airline operators. However, across the Atlantic, darker developments were materializing that would evaluate Caldwell's innovation under circumstances no peacetime engineer could anticipate. While Frank Caldwell refined his propeller concepts in Connecticut, European aircraft manufacturers lagged dangerously behind American advancement. Within the sprawling Messerschmitt operations outside Augsburg, Germany's most sophisticated fighter, the Bf-109, still depended upon manually adjustable propellers that required aviators to constantly manipulate angle controls during combat. British Supermarine Spitfires and Hawker Hurricanes utilized primitive dual-position propellers that offered exclusively steep angle for high-velocity flight or shallow angle for ascending with no intermediate configurations and no automatic adjustment capability. The lethal ramifications of this technological disparity became evident during the initial months of conflict. RAF combat documentation from September 1939 illustrated a severe situation that disturbed Air Ministry administrators at night. German Bf 109s consistently outclimbed British fighters above 15,000 feet were manually adjusted. Propellers granted Luftwaffe aviators a crucial superiority. RAF bombing crews documented abandoning operations when their aircraft couldn't achieve sufficient elevation to clear the Alps or evade German interceptors. Fighter command aviators lost precious seconds during ascents to intercept elevation, seconds that frequently represented the distinction between engaging hostile bombers before they achieved their objectives or observing helplessly as German formations vanished into cloud cover. Air Marshal Hugh Dowding, the methodical Scottish commander who directed Fighter Command, privately concerned that Britain's fighters were technologically outmatched in the approaching confrontation for aerial superiority. Intelligence documentation from France described German aviators who could optimize their aircraft performance throughout an engagement, while RAF aviators struggled with manual angle regulations that demanded constant attention during the precise instances when concentration should remain on hostile aircraft. At the 1938 Society of Automotive Engineers Conference in Detroit, Caldwell presented information that should have alarmed every military aviation authority in attendance. His comparison of constant rotation versus fixed-angle performance, utilizing identical power plants, revealed figures that bordered on transformative. Static thrust, the force available for departure and initial ascent, was 40% greater with automatic angle regulation. Ascent velocity below 10,000 feet increased by 35%. Fuel consumption at cruising elevation decreased by 15%. Most significantly, combat ceiling increased by more than 6,000 feet, granting properly equipped fighters a decisive elevation superiority. Nevertheless, European aeronautical engineers dismissed these figures as theoretical superiorities with practical disadvantages that would prove catastrophic in combat circumstances. Dr. Ernst Heinkel, designer of Germany's fastest fighters and bombers, publicly contended that hydraulic propeller mechanisms represented American over-engineering that sacrifices dependability for marginal performance gains. British propeller manufacturers echoed these assessments, maintaining that manually controlled angle provided aviators with more precise regulation during combat maneuvering. The manufacturing challenge confronting Hamilton Standard intensified with each passing month as military orders multiplied. Each constant rotation propeller required 47 precision-machined elements with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch and assembly protocols that demanded skilled technicians operating with specialized equipment. The Enterprise's East Hartford operation expanded to function 3 shifts, 7 days weekly. However, demand consistently surpassed capacity as the Army, Air Corps, Navy, and allied procurement agencies competed for limited manufacturing. Quality regulation became Caldwell's fixation and his nightmare, a singular batch of defective regulators, the critical elements that managed lubrication pressure and controlled surface. Engel caused 3 propellers to lose hydraulic pressure during evaluation. Flights at Wright Field. The malfunctions occurred during replicated combat maneuvers, precisely the circumstances where dependability was most crucial. Army Air Corps acquisition administrators threatened to cancel pending orders valued at $12 million. Critics throughout the aviation sector seized upon the incidents as confirmation that constant rotation propellers were excessively complex for combat, circumstances where simplicity equals survival. Caldwell's response demonstrated the methodical determination that had characterized his professional life. Collaborating with a team of Hamilton Standard's finest engineers, he redesigned the regulator mechanism in 6 weeks, implementing redundant pressure circuits and backup mechanical regulations that would sustain basic propeller operation. Even if the primary hydraulic mechanism failed entirely, new evaluation protocols subjected every propeller to strain, levels that surpassed combat circumstances by 50%. Most significantly, Caldwell instituted a protocol of personally examining and authorizing every propeller delivered to military customers. The dependability enhancements arrived at a critical juncture. By early 1939, Luftwaffe strength had expanded to over 4,000 aircraft, while RAF Fighter Command possessed fewer than 700 operational fighters. German aircraft manufacturing was accelerating rapidly, with new operations producing sophisticated concepts like the Bf-109E model and the twin power plant Bf-110 destroyer. Intelligence documentation indicated that German bombers possessed the distance and ceiling to engage any objective in Britain, while RAF fighters struggled to intercept high-elevation formations. The technological disparity became tragically evident during the Battle of France. RAF Hurricane and Spitfire squadrons, equipped with dual-position propellers, found themselves consistently outperformed by German fighters above 20,000 feet. Flight Lieutenant Douglas Bader, commanding 242 Squadron, documented that German aircraft ascend away from us at will above 15,000 feet. Our propellers simply cannot provide the thrust needed for sustained high-elevation combat. Squadron casualties mounted steadily as RAF aviators discovered that their aircraft's performance envelope was fatally inadequate against opposition that could select when and where to engage. By June 1940, with German armies advancing toward the Channel coastline and the Luftwaffe preparing for the assault on Britain, Fighter Command confronted a technological crisis that threatened the outcome of the entire conflict. The identical constant rotation propellers that American evaluation aviators praised as transformative remained largely absent from RAF squadrons. Casualties of administrative inertia and industrial opposition to modification. Squadron leader Desmond Cook of 65. Squadron at Hornchurch understood superior to most what his aviators confronted in the approaching confrontation. Having operated Spitfires against German fighters above France, he recognized that RAF performance deficiencies weren't matters of aviator capability or aircraft concept. They were technical problems with technical solutions. As Luftwaffe formations assembled across the Channel for Operation Eagle Attack, Cook prepared to submit an urgent request that would evaluate whether British administration could adapt sufficiently rapid to preserve fighter command from technological obsolescence. Squadron leader Desmond. Cook positioned himself in the operations chamber at RAF Hornchurch, June 10, 1940, examining intelligence photographs that confirmed his gravest concerns. Luftwaffe formations were assembling at airfields throughout northern France, Stukas, Heinkels, Dorniers, and the dreaded Messerschmitt escorts that had dominated the atmosphere above France. Within weeks, perhaps days, they would approach Britain, and Fighter Command would confront them with aircraft that ascended too gradually and couldn't achieve the elevations where confrontations would be determined. Cook had operated Spitfires above Dunkirk, observing helplessly as German fighters ascended away from his squadron at will above 20,000 feet. The calculations were brutally straightforward. His aircraft required 11 minutes and 8 seconds to achieve 20,000 feet, while Messerschmitt Bf-109s could accomplish the identical elevation in under 9 minutes. In aerial combat, those additional 2.5 minutes represented the distinction between intercepting hostile bombers before they achieved their objectives and arriving too late to prevent devastation. The solution existed in American operations, but British administration progressed with glacial slowness, while German invasion preparations accelerated daily. Cook circumvented standard procedures and placed a direct communication to de Havilland Propellers, the British licensee for Hamilton Standard's constant rotation concepts. His request was urgent and explicit. retrofit his squadron Spitfires with American-designed propellers immediately regardless of official authorization or procedural requirements. The conversion operation commenced within 48 hours, functioning under emergency authorization from Air Marshal Dowding himself. De Havilland engineers operated continuously in requisitioned facilities at Hatfield, modifying Spitfire Mickeys from obsolete dual-position propellers to fully automatic constant rotation mechanisms. Each conversion required 8 hours of precision labor, removing the old propeller assembly, installing hydraulic lines, calibrating the regulator mechanism, and conducting ground evaluations to ensure proper operation. Fighter Command could spare aircraft for exclusively 24-hour periods, creating a logistical nightmare where squadrons functioned with reduced strength while their aircraft underwent emergency modifications. The first converted Spitfire emerged from the Hatfield facility June 15, 1940. Cook personally conducted the initial evaluation flight, departing from the Grass Aerodrome in aircraft serial number K9847. The enhancement was immediately evident during the departure roll. The propeller automatically adjusted to shallow angle, permitting the Merlin power plant to develop maximum thrust while sustaining optimal RPM. Where his previous aircraft had required 320 yards to become airborne, the modified Spitfire lifted off in 225 yards. However, the genuine revelation arrived during the ascent evaluation. Cook advanced throttle to maximum continuous thrust and commenced his ascent toward 20,000 feet, the elevation where Fighter Command anticipated engaging German bomber formations. The constant rotation propeller adjusted continuously as atmospheric density diminished, sustaining power plant RPM while automatically optimizing surface angle for maximum thrust. At 5,000 feet, 10,000, 15,000, the Spitfire ascended with authority that Cook had never experienced in 3 years operating the type. 20,000 feet, 7 minutes 42 seconds, nearly 4 minutes faster than his previous optimal time in an identical aircraft. Cook continued ascending, observing his altimeter register heights that would have been impossible with the old propeller. 35,000 feet, 37,000, at 39,000 feet, where the atmosphere was so thin that his respiration frosted inside the cockpit, despite summer temperatures at ground level. The Spitfire finally achieved its performance ceiling. The tactical implications were staggering. Fighter Command had been planning defensive tactics based on aircraft that struggled to achieve 32,000 feet and required over 11 minutes to ascend to intercept elevation. Suddenly, RAF fighters could function 7,000 feet higher and achieve fighting elevation in 2/3 the duration. German bomber formations operating at 25,000 feet, previously secure from effective interception, now faced Spitfires attacking from above with energy superiority. Cook landed at Hornchurch and immediately telephoned Fighter Command headquarters. His documentation was terse and urgent. The Spitfire is now an aircraft. Request immediate conversion of entire squadron. Within 72 hours, all 12 operational Spitfires of 65 Squadron had been retrofitted with constant rotation propellers. The aviators' reactions ranged from astonishment to disbelief as they discovered aircraft performance they had never imagined possible. Flight Lieutenant Brian Lane, a veteran of the French campaign, described the transformation in his combat diary. "It's as if someone replaced our power plants with twice the thrust. We can ascend with the 109s now. Match them elevation for elevation. For the first occasion since this conflict began, we're not fighting at a disadvantage." Similar conversions commenced immediately throughout Fighter Command, with de Havilland engineers operating 18-hour shifts to retrofit Spitfires and Hurricanes before the German assault commenced. The figures that would preserve Britain were becoming reality across Fighter Command airfields. By September 1940, 90% of RAF fighters carried constant rotation propellers, Combat documentation from the early phases of the Battle of Britain recorded the dramatic modification in tactical capability. RAF ascent velocity superiority allowed fighter command to achieve intercept elevation 2 to 3 minutes faster than German projections. Operational ceiling superiority of 4,000 feet above German fighters meant that Spitfires could attack from positions where Messerschmitt aviators couldn't effectively respond. Most significantly, improved fuel conservation extended patrol duration by 45 minutes, permitting RAF squadrons to sustain standing patrols above German approach routes. The strategic impact extended beyond individual aircraft performance. Air Chief Marshal Dowding's defensive framework depended on radar early warning and rapid scramble response to confront German formations before they achieved their objectives. Every minute preserved in ascent to elevation multiplied the effectiveness of fighter command's limited resources. Aviators who had spent the summer of 1939 observing German aircraft escaped to higher elevations now found themselves able to select when and where to engage. The transformation was perhaps most evident in aviator workload reduction. Constant rotation propellers eliminated the requirement for manual angle adjustment during combat, liberating aviators to concentrate entirely on tactics and gunnery rather than power plant management. The German aviators, still struggling with manually controlled propellers, who found themselves at a severe disadvantage when RAF fighters appeared above them with elevation and energy superiority that British aircraft had never possessed previously, as Luftwaffe formations assembled across the Channel for the final assault on Britain. Fighter command waited with aircraft that bore little resemblance to the fighters that had struggled above France just months earlier. Frank Caldwell's impossible propeller had granted the RAF the performance margin that would determine whether Britain survived or fell to German invasion. America's entry into the conflict following Pearl Harbor transformed Hamilton Standard from a specialized manufacturer into the cornerstone of Allied aerial supremacy. Every B-17 Flying Fortress, B-24 Liberator, P-51 Mustang, P-47 Thunderbolt, and P-38 Lightning required Caldwell's propellers to achieve their combat potential. The manufacturing demands were staggering beyond anything peacetime sector had imagined. By 1942, Hamilton's standards, contract ledgers displayed agreements for 530,135 propeller assemblies, enough to equip every combat aircraft in the American arsenal and provide spares for continuous operations across multiple theaters of conflict. The East Hartford operation that had employed 800 workers in 1932 now sprawled across multiple sites with 22,000 employees operating 3 shifts continuously, manufacturing. Partnerships extended to Frigidaire, Nash Kelvinator, and Remington Rand as automobile and appliance enterprises retooled their assembly operations for aircraft propeller manufacturing. Peak monthly output achieved 12,000 complete propeller assemblies, each requiring precision machining that demanded tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. However, mass manufacturing created unprecedented quality regulation, challenges that haunted Caldwell's nights and dominated his days. Malfunction rates increased as inexperienced workers struggled with complex assembly protocols. Statistical examination revealed a disturbing pattern. Propellers manufactured during peak manufacturing periods demonstrated higher malfunction rates than units constructed during the careful pre-conflict era when skilled technicians personally examined every element. The crisis achieved its peak above the industrial municipality of Schweinfurt. October 14, 1943, B-17 serial number 42-31041, nicknamed Hell's Angels by its crew, was fighting for elevation after flak burst damaged its number 3 power plant above the objective area. The feathering mechanism designed to eliminate resistance by rotating failed power plant propellers parallel to the airstream engaged normally, permitting the bomber to sustain formation during the bombing run. However, during the ascent to escape elevation, a manufacturing defect in the hydraulic regulator caused the feathered propeller to gradually rotate back into the airstream, creating massive resistance that pulled the B-17 into an uncontrollable descent. 9 airmen perished when Hell's Angels crashed in a Bavarian forest. The subsequent investigation traced the malfunction to contaminated hydraulic fluid that had frozen solid at 30,000 feet, preventing the regulator mechanism from sustaining surface position. Quality regulation inspectors discovered similar contamination in 47 propellers from the identical manufacturing batch, all delivered to 8th Air Force squadrons functioning from English bases. Frank Caldwell, now 54, and bearing the weight of industrial accountability that no peacetime engineer could have imagined, assumed personal responsibility for the malfunction. He flew to England on a War Department transport, consulting with bomber crews at bases throughout East Anglia to understand precisely how his propellers performed under combat circumstances. The conversations were brutally candid. Technical Sergeant Michael Romano, flight engineer on a B-24 crew, described propeller malfunctions that had cost his squadron 3 aircraft in 14 days. "The feathering mechanism functions fine in training flights above Kansas," Romano stated. "However, above Germany with flak fragments and battle destruction, these complex mechanisms malfunction when we require them most." Caldwell returned to Connecticut and immediately redesigned the feathering mechanism, implementing redundant hydraulic circuits and backup mechanical mechanisms that could sustain surface position even if primary regulations failed entirely. New quality regulation protocols subjected every propeller to environmental evaluations that replicated combat circumstances. Temperature cycling from 60 degrees below freezing to 140 degrees above. Vibration evaluation that surpassed combat strain by 75%. And contamination trials utilizing hydraulic fluid deliberately polluted with metallic particles, ice crystals, and chemical residues that might accumulate during extended combat operations. By 1943, the dependability enhancements had created the most reliable propeller mechanism in aviation chronicle. Combat casualty statistics from the European theater demonstrated that propeller-related malfunctions had decreased to less than 1% of total mechanical problems, lower than power plant malfunctions, landing gear breakdowns, or electrical mechanism failures. The feathering mechanism that had initially caused problems now routinely preserved aircraft and crews. 8th Air Force operational records documented hundreds of bombers that returned safely to England after losing one or more power plants above German territory. Their constant rotation propellers automatically, feathering to eliminate resistance and permit continued flight on functioning power plants. The strategic impact became evident when American aircraft commenced encountering German and Japanese fighters in large-scale combat. B-51 Mustangs equipped with Caldwell's propellers demonstrated decisive performance superiorities above Messerschmitt Bf-109K models, 30 miles per hour, velocity superiority, and 5,000 feet of ceiling superiority that permitted American aviators to select when and where to engage. B-17 Flying Fortresses could cruise 50 miles per hour faster than comparable German bombers while functioning 8,000 feet higher, placing them beyond the effective ceiling of most Luftwaffe interceptors. The Pacific Theater revealed even more dramatic superiorities. P-47 Thunderbolts, initially dismissed as excessively heavy for fighter combat, achieved 40% superior ascent velocities than Japanese Zero fighters when equipped with constant rotation propellers. The automatic angle regulation permitted American aviators to sustain optimal power plant performance. During the rapid elevation modifications that characterized Pacific aerial combat, while Japanese aviators struggled with manual propeller regulations that demanded constant attention during precisely the instances when concentration should remain on hostile aircraft. General Carl Tui Spaatz, commanding U.S. strategic air forces in Europe, summarized the transformation in a confidential documentation to the Pentagon. The constant rotation propeller has granted American aircraft decisive performance superiorities in every theater where we function. It is as strategically important as radar, long-distance navigation, or any other singular advancement we possess. Statistical examination conducted by the Army Air Forces in 1945 revealed that constant rotation propellers had directly prevented an estimated 15,000 Allied aircraft casualties. Through improved ascent performance that enabled escape from hostile fighters, higher operational ceilings that permitted operations above interceptor elevations, feathering capability that permitted safe return after power plant malfunctions, and superior fuel conservation that reduced forced landings due to fuel exhaustion. Frank Caldwell's impossible propeller, dismissed by authorities as excessively complex for combat operations, had proven more dependable under battle circumstances than the fixed-angle concepts it replaced. The advancement that skeptics claimed would sacrifice American aviators' survival had instead preserved thousands of airmen while providing the performance margins that made Allied triumph possible.